Okay, we're going to try something a little bit different today. I had some issues with how my Coolpix was recording finer details, so I decided to experiment with my cell phone, which is a Samsung Galaxy S3, and we'll try to record all of the equipment here. And the horn that we're going to discuss today is a 1923 Conn New Wonder Alto Saxophone. And this has been my horn of choice, alto of choice anyway, for the past decade. And honestly, it will probably be the last horn that I need. Obviously not the last horn that I want. There are always cool new toys to try, but for playability and durability, this horn has gone through hell and back, and I'm lucky to have found it, and we'll go over why. As previously mentioned, with this neck, the micro tuner is working. I tore that apart, cleaned it all apart very recently, and actually what we'll do, we'll start from the top on down. The neck being the most important part of this horn. There is a good amount of resistance in the saxophone. It is not a free-blowing horn at all. It's a blow that kind of demands respect, and it has the balls to, wherever you push it, it will go. There's a lot of volume in this horn, and also I think a lot of control. It's got more of that Selmer-esque kind of centered tone in the mid-range. A lot of horns kind of scatter and spread and let you kind of voice how you want the horn to play. This horn has a more set tone. It's a very large tone. It is flexible with the right mouthpiece, but not nearly as flexible as other altos as I've tried. The mouthpiece of choice with this horn, there are actually two of them that I've found that work very, very well. This is a standard run-of-the-mill Auto-Link modern production STM, and you can see that is a 6-star, and nothing special about this. I've never even run gauges on this, so it's probably as imperfect Auto-Link as you could get these days, essentially a blank. But that said, the most important thing why this works is in that chamber, and it's kind of hard to see with the lighting, but that is a very big, deep chamber. The second mouthpiece, which I do not have out right now, that really works well with this horn is, of all things, a Yamaha 4C. And honestly, it has all the perks of the Link, a little less flexibility, but it's also a little bit easier to draw out overtones and split tones. But why I'm bringing this up, this isn't really a mouthpiece review per se, but these horns are designed with a larger to mid chamber in mind, which means that the Auto-Links will work great on them. I've had good luck with the Meyer mouthpieces, the hard rubbers, and the Yamaha the Yamaha 4C is probably as narrow of a chamber as you want to get, which is, in the grand scheme of things, I'd say a mid-chamber piece. But it really, really works out well. But if you start getting more narrow than that, the horn really does not like that, and we'll go into why in a minute. But working down to the horn, this is one thing that I'm probably going to eventually get adjusted, is that neck tenon socket. It's single screw, and even when the screw is tight, the neck has a tendency to jiggle around a little bit once it's work free in there. So I mean, you can see it's not really of a beefy or substantial design. which is why a lot of techs have added a second ring to that, and why Conn even went to the double socket neck later. There's just not really that much grip there, and I would imagine it's not airtight either. No real way for me to test that myself, but considering how much free play there is, even when I tighten that screw as hard as I can, I'd imagine that isn't airtight. Fortunately, it is not a deal breaker with the horn. But moving along, if you could see here, I mean, get some pretty good shots of the key work. During this time period in 23, Conn was still kind of refining their key work, and honestly, that was probably the Achilles heel of these earlier Series 1 New Wonders, was that they were essentially cutting these out of sheet metal, and many of the keys, and this is actually a pretty decent example. I know Matt Stower mentioned this in his video with the tenor models, and honestly, his example of how poorly cut the tenor has been rings true with everything I've seen with the tenors and larger horns. The sopranos and altos seem to have been cut better. The keywork looked better, and I know there's a video online where Saxworks Denmark actually goes over how weak this keywork is. The metal is relatively soft in it and is pretty easy to bend, where luckily where you're working with shorter leverages, as you would have with the soprano and alto, it doesn't seem to be that big of a deal. I've used this horn very, very often the past 10 years. I've never had issues with the keywork bending. But to give you an example, and this is actually true to every New Wonder I've seen, you can see here how this B key, which has I believe that's actually the longest linkage in this whole mechanism, you can see how it has a tendency to well, eventually bend, and that's just for normal key pressure. And pay attention to the earlier Series 2 New Wonders and even the best examples of the Series 1s. And this is a nickel-plated horn, which was on their, well, they were all pro horns back then, but the gold and silver-plated were, you know, more expensive, prestigious horns, but they all have this same problem. And I've seen some very gorgeous, you know, virtuoso deluxe models that have that same bent B key, and that is a testament to how weak the key work actually is. And if you could see here as well, this G sharp actually was pushed in. It's been like that since before I bought it, and even when it was overhauled, we didn't feel it necessary to really bend it back, as everything else with the pad work was, you know, compensating for it. And here we have the forked E-flat mechanism. Mine is still activated and fully functional. There's an extra little linkage in there. It's kind of hard to see, but a lot of techs will reverse spring this to keep it shut, because it's just one other thing to go wrong. More play and the action can develop, you know, with these two screws here, and a couple other things that you have to keep an eye out for. But if you have the right bumper material, the right tech, and God willing the internals of the rod weren't worn down too bad to begin with, my personal opinion is there's nothing really there that needs to be reverse sprung. And if that's, you know, maintained well with the rest of the horn, leave it be. I mean, it's a cool little feature, and I do use it quite often. The horn itself is, as you can see, nickel plated. It's an extremely durable nickel plate too. There was substantial wear when I first got the horn, and you could see it mostly in the neck. I don't know if that was from the previous owner, you know, pulling it off, putting it back on without ever wiping it down, which is more than likely the case. When I had this horn overhauled a few years ago, we did decide to buff it, which wore down some of the lower spots of this horn, which will happen if you buff a horn that's 90 years old. But even with that said, I mean, it's relatively easy to maintain and clean. Every so often I have to just take a rag and polish it a little bit. I don't use any type of chemicals on it. With nickel plate, you do not want to use a silver polish. That's very, very important, and there's a couple reasons why. Any type of metal polish actually has bits and pieces of the source metal in it, and that acts as a buffer, and that will wear down the plating of your instrument if you do it too much, too often. The second thing with silver polish, since it has silver in it, it will actually, the polish, bits and pieces of the polish actually remain on the horn, and those bits and pieces of the silver in there will actually begin to tarnish. So you could actually get a nickel plated horn to tarnish if you use silver polish on it. So do not do that. And of course it's the polish itself tarnishing, but you can't tell the difference. Right here is the biggest spot of wear, actually, and that looks a lot greener on camera up on that thumb hook than it actually is. It's actually a dark gray where there's a little cut in the nickel plate that's meeting the brass, and that is actually all me from my own thumb, 10 years of playing it. And I do have fairly acidic, I guess, sweat or oils in my hand, and the student horns I played, student Yamaha 23s, that actually have very good nickel plating on them themselves. I've worn down many bigger wears in the nickel plate. So, I mean, this is a 90-year-old horn that had some miles on it, before I picked it up, and it's overall in great shape. Conn had several different stencils that they used, several different floral patterns for their engraving, and this particular horn has this little engraving here. It says Williams, Montreal, which was actually put there from the original store that sold it. So this was a Canadian, well, American-made horn that was sold in Canada. Okay. And like I said, you can see how close, I mean, this is about as good a condition as you could get nickel plate in. You can see here, that is the only roller that isn't original. I would love to know why, but for some reason, this always seems to be the case with these new wonders, that the low C roller always seems to lock up, jam, break. Most often when I see these horns, I notice that this same roller is missing and replaced with an aftermarket plastic piece. Now, well, if you're familiar with these horns, you probably have heard about the low B. If you have not, these have a tendency to, some people call it a warble, some people call it a gurgle. Essentially what it is an unwanted multiphonic or overtone, and there are a couple reasons why this would pop up in this horn. Number one, mouthpiece. And there we got the train interrupting me in the background. Don't mind that. Kind of musical if you listen to it. But number one is the mouthpiece. Like I said, these are mouthpiece picky, and when horns of this era were designed, they were designed with a large chamber mouthpiece in mind. So the modern pea shooter does not lend itself to these horns at all. Next problem, like I said, that screw there, that whole tenon socket really isn't designed that well where, I mean, if you look at a modern Yamaha or Selmer, there's an extra ring there, and there are a couple other companies that have gone to great lengths to make sure that that's sealing well. And, you know, any leak that you create, essentially the saxophone is one long tube. We have tone holes cut in to create different pitches in that tube, and then different octave vents, but any leak that's created is essentially creating a small octave vent. And sometimes you could blow past them, sometimes you cannot. And other times, you know, a small octave that you could somewhat fight creates like a split harmonic, essentially a multiphonic. And when you're doing multiphonic fingerings, that's essentially what you're doing, is creating leaks in which two harmonics are battling against each other. And if you blow them the right way, and you mix your knowledge of the overtone series with that, you could get different multiphonic sounds out of, you know, one fingering. But whenever you're experiencing a gurgle, it's essentially the same thing, except you're not doing a fingering. There's a leak somewhere or some design flaw that is bouncing those harmonics around, and that was the case with this horn. So if your cork's good, your micro tuner, make sure that that is airtight. Those also have a tendency to wear down a leak. So we got good mouthpiece, cork, micro tuner. Of course, make sure that all your pads are seating well. Neck tenon, make sure that that's good. And the connection points here with the bow, the bell, and the body, these were actually soldered into place. And a lot of companies later on, I believe everything now is actually like a plastic resin or glue. I think Yamaha started that. But back in these days, they were silver soldered or soft soldered. And what has a tendency to happen is, years and years, this nickel plate is tough on the outside, but the underlying solder begins to deteriorate. And you have small holes forming on the inside here. This guard right here, the connection guard or brace, is not airtight. That's being held together with silver solder underneath. So if that begins losing its integrity underneath, you're developing leaks. And look what you have beyond the leaks. You would have your B flat and B tone holes. So you are creating substantial leaks in your lowest, on the lowest end of the horn, which can also be the cause of gurgle or unwanted multiphonics. So if everything is working fine, all the mechanical issues have been tested, checked, and, you know, all the pads are new and are seating, there is one other issue with this horn, and it's actually right here, the bow. These horns were handmade, and the design flaw in a lot of them was this bow is actually too steep. If you look at the dimensions of the tubing here, it's actually too deep and is mismatched to the body and bell of the horn. And it's usually too deep like this, and this is exaggeration of what I'm trying to say, but the air column, that space in between my fingers there, is what is wrong with this particular horn. And this was not uncommon. As a matter of fact, there were certain vintages of the Mark VI Alto that had the opposite problem, where the tubing was, there was too much space in here. And Selmer came up with a quick fix to that, where they actually added a baffle or piece of metal that would actually fit right around this area and would narrow that air column. With the Conn, it's the opposite problem, like I said, where it's too deep. And when I figured that out, and that was when I was still in high school, trying to figure all this out. Got lucky here and had a quarter You can see that right down there. That is actually a flattened out quarter I had from, we set it on, you know, railroad tracks because it was cool to watch the train smash things. But that quarter actually formed a little plate that narrowed the air column at the bottom of that bow, and it was enough to stabilize that B, where this particular horn has one of the nicest, luscious low Bs that you could possibly imagine from an alto. You don't have to really blow that hard with it at all. It's a very overtone, rich B, and eventually I'll mic that all up and demonstrate that, maybe with a little play along tune or something down the road. But when selecting a baffle material like that, which is actually necessary with some of these Conns, I actually lucked out with picking a quarter. And the reason why, well, what's a saxophone made out of? Essentially brass, and in this case it's nickel-plated brass. There's something called electrolysis, and what happens is if you have two unlike metals contacting each other for prolonged periods of time, it actually creates a chemical reaction, and there is electricity involved where the molecules of both metals, or one or both metals, begin breaking down. So if I pick the wrong type of metal, that may have reacted badly with the brass. But since I picked a modern production quarter, which is nickel-plated copper, it actually went right along with this nickel-plated brass. And for those of you that don't know, brass is an alloy made out of tin and copper. So I'm essentially threw in a plate that is made out of the same source material as the rest of the horn, so those will not react with each other. So that was dumb luck. But something to keep in mind if you have to make this modification yourself. A standard quarter, if you flatten it out the right way, seems to work well. And I moved it around in the bow before finding the sweet spot. The only thing that's holding it in is a liberal amount of epoxy underneath. And if you're doing that, you know, I removed the low C key and was messing around with it by getting into that C tone hole. I found where it worked best and then glued it in. Speaking of tone holes, these have the rolled variety. Now, fortunately, I never had the opportunity to take a die myself to check the integrity of these tone holes. But that is the old rolled tone hole design, where they actually, you know, draw the tone holes and then roll the rest of the excess metal over top. And the idea was that you would have longer pad life because you have more surface area in which the pad meets the tone hole. That does seem to be the case. I've never had an issue where this horn, where the tone holes have actually ripped the leather itself. However, there is a drawback. With more surface area equals more gunk that could build up on the surface area on the pad, and you get stickier pads. Now, that in of itself, if the pad is sticky enough and gains enough crud in between the two, that could actually rip the leather of the pad as well. And this is something I suppose saxophone manufacturers have figured out since. That, and it's much more difficult to actually true those tone holes where they drop those. So, I mean, I never have any real issues with those, but I do keep an eye on it, especially I'm in the northeast section of the United States, and we get kind of humid up here. So when that happens, and I do this with all my horns anyway, before I start playing, I check to make sure that the low C sharp, G sharp, and Bisbee flat keys are not sticking. And if you're having any issue with humidity, mugginess, or need to run a piece of sandpaper between the two to get any crud or gunk, those are going to be your 3 telltale spots to let you know, hey, it's the pads are sticky, and keep an eye out for that. Just to go over, if you're thinking about picking one of these up, just a quick little tutorial on the actual serial number. Up top is the patent December 8th, 1914, and then the patent number underneath that, and that is actually the patent number for the Haynes rolled tone hole design, and that was actually a patent intended for flutes, but Conn was carrying it over to the saxophone line as well. Below that you have the letter A, which is, well, you can probably guess, alto. Alto saxophone. And below that is the serial number. This is 121,000 to, looks like 16. And my best estimate puts that around, well, late 1923, I'd guess around October or November. And below that is L, for low pitch, which means it fits our modern standard of tuning. High pitch would be a European standard of tuning, and it was, I believe, A equals 457 back then instead of A equals 440, which isn't a substantial difference, but if you really want to grasp what high pitch is, take a listen to some old German polkas from around World War II, and there's actually some band organs that still exist, and Wurlitzer made them at the time, and they play this music, and if you listen to it, you'll notice something different subconsciously. Where you'll really notice it is if you take a fixed pitched instrument, say an electronic keyboard, and try playing along, finding the tonal center and the key. And that's where it will really stand out, and you will not be able to find the correct key because it's actually essentially keys within keys. And it's something that your mind picks up subconsciously, and it's actually pretty cool when you could actually test it and actually hear the difference. And it's the reason why a high-pitched horn will not be able to play in tune with a modern ensemble. And the general theory is, or the novice theory is, you could just pull the mouthpiece out and make the horn flatter. That will work for 1, 2, 3, a couple notes, but you're on a system of compromises here. So that means if you pull out in tune to 1 or 2 notes, the rest of the scale is going to be extremely flat. So a high-pitched horn, unless you're doing some old-school German polkas or, you know, European classical music, it's not going to work. But that pretty much sums up this horn, and like I said, with the alto version, the keywork is generally cut a little bit better than the tenor counterparts. You could take a look with the tenors. I mean, something like this in the upper stack. You can see how everything is in line and straight. That would be extremely uncommon for a tenor. And it's not perfect, mind you, but it is pretty adequate. With a good overhaul, I mean, they are really good players. The only other thing that you would have to watch out for is this bell brace. Do not drop this horn. It will cause you a lot of problems. Three-point design wasn't in play yet. But that's it, and hope you enjoyed this. And if you have any questions, comment below or send me a message, and I'll answer any questions from there. All right, and you have a great day.